Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be reading the very first chapter of The Great Cosmic Mother by Monica Sjoo and Barbara Moore. And it is the first sex. In the beginning, we were all created female. I'm Lynsey Bourke, and thank you so much for joining me on this journey into The Great Cosmic Mother. So, in the beginning was a very female sea. For 2.5 billion years on Earth, all life forms floated in the womb-like environment of the planetary ocean, nourished and protected by its fluid chemicals, rocked by the lunar tidal rhythms. Charles Darwin believed the menstrual cycle originated here, organically echoing the moon pulse of the sea. And because this longest period of life's time on Earth was dominated by marine forms reproducing parthenogenically, he concluded that the female principle was primordial. In the beginning, life did not gestate within the body of any creature, but within the ocean womb, containing all organic life. There was no specialized sex organs, rather a generalized female existence, reproducing itself within the female body of the sea. Before more complex life forms could develop and move on to land, it was necessary to miniaturize the oceanic environment, to reproduce it on a small and mobile scale. Soft, moist eggs deposited on dry ground and exposed to air would die. Life could not move beyond the water-hugging exposed amphibian stage. In the course of evolution, the ocean, the protective and nourishing space, the amniotic fluids, and even the lunar tidal rhythm was transferred into the individual female body. And the penis, a mechanical device for land reproduction, evolved. The penis first appeared in the age of the reptiles about 200 million years ago. Our archetypal association of the snake with the phallus contains, no doubt, this genetic memory. This is a fundamental and reoccurring pattern in nature. Life is a female environment in which the male appears, often periodically, and created by the female. The two perform highly specialized tasks related to species reproduction and a more complex evolution. Daphnia, a freshwater crustacean, reproduces several generations of females by parthenogenesis. The egg and its own polar body mate to form a complete set of genes for a female offspring. And once annually, at the end of every year's cycle, a short-lived male group is produced. The males specialize in manufacturing leathery egg cases able to survive the winter. Among honeybees, the drone group is produced and regulated by a sterile daughter workers, and the fertile queens. Drones exist to mate with the queen. An average of 7 drones per hive accomplish this act each season, and then the entire male group is destroyed by its workers. Among the whiptail lizards of the American Southwest, 4 species are parthenogenic. Males are unknown among the desert grasslands, plateau, and Chihuahua whiptails, and have been found only rarely among the checkered whiptails. Among mammals, even among humans, parthenogenesis is not technically impossible. Every female egg contains a polar body with a complete set of chromosomes. The polar body and the egg. The polar body and the egg, if united, could form a daughter embryo. In fact, ovarian cysts are unfertilized eggs that have joined with their polar bodies, been implanted in the ovarian wall, and started to develop there. This is not to say that males are the unnecessary sex. Parthenogenesis is a cloning process. Sexual reproduction, which enhances the variety and health of the gene pool, is necessary for the kind of complex evolution that has produced the human species. The point being made here, simply that, when it comes to the two sexes, one of us has been around a lot longer than the other. In The Nature and Evolution of Female Sexuality, Mary Jane Sjoo, MD, described her discovery in 1961 of something called the inductor theory. The inductor theory stated that all mammalian embryos, male and female, are anatomically female during the early stages of fetal life. Sjoo wondered why this theory had been buried in the medical literature since 1951, completely ignored by the profession. The men who made this history-making discovery simply didn't want it to be true. Sjoo pioneered the discussion of the inductor theory, and now with modifications based on further data, its findings are accepted as facts of mammalian, including human, development. As Stephen Jay Gould describes it, the embryo in its first 8 weeks is an indifferent creature with bisexual potential. In the 8th week, if a Y chromosome bearing sperm fuses with the egg, the gonads will develop into testes, which secrete androgen, and in turn induces male genitalia to develop. In the absence of androgen, the embryo develops into a female. There is a difference in the development of the internal and external genitalia, however. For the internal genitalia, the fallopian tubes and ovaries, or the sperm-carrying ducts, the early embryo contains precursors of both sexes. In the presence or absence of androgen, as one set develops and the other disintegrates. With the external genitalia, the different organs of male and female develop along diverging lines with the same precursor. This means, in effect, that the clitoris and the penis are the same organ, formed from the same tissue. The labia majora and the scrotum are one, indistinguishable in the early embryonic stages. And in the presence of androgen, the two lips simply grow longer, fold over, and fuse along the midline, forming the scrotal sac. Gould continues, the female course of development, in a sense, is biologically intrinsic to all mammals. It is the pattern that unfolds in the absence of any hormonal influence. The male route is a modification induced by secretion of androgens from the developing testes. The vulnerability of the male newcomer within the female environment is well known. Vaginal secretions are more destructive to the Y-bearing sperm. The mortality rate is higher among neonate and infant males. Within the womb, the male fetus, for the first 2 months, is protected by being virtually indistinguishable from a female, and that it must produce large amounts of the masculinizing hormone in order to define itself as male, to achieve and to maintain its sexual identity. For all we know, the Near Eastern myths upon which our Western mythologies are built, those which portray the young god or hero battling against a female dragon, have some analog here. In utero, where the male fetus wages a kind of chemical war against becoming female. For now, it is enough to say that maleness among mammals is not a primary state, but differentiates from the original female biochemistry and anatomy. The original libido of warm-blooded animals is female, and the male, or maleness, is a derivation of its primary female pattern. Why then did the medical men, the scientists, take longer to figure out this basic biological fact than it took them to split an atom? And why, once this fact was noted, did they turn around and bury it in professional silence for 10 years until a woman dug it up again? Why indeed? For about 2,000 years of Western history, female sexuality was denied. And when it could not be denied, it was condemned as evil. The female was seen as divinely designed to be a passive vessel, serving reproductive purposes only. In one not too ancient dictionary, clitoris was defined as a rudimentary organ, while masculinity equaled the cosmic generative force. With Freud, female sexuality was not so much as rediscovered as pathologized. Freud dismissed the clitoris as an underdeveloped masculine organ and defined original libido as male. Clitoral eroticism was produced to a perverse neuroses. Even after Masters and Johnson's laboratory studies were published in Human Sexual Response in 1966, their findings were not integrated into psychoanalytical theory. In Mary Jane Sherfy's research during that period, she found not one work of comparative anatomy that described or even mentioned the deeper lying clitoral structures, yet every other structure of the human body was described in living detail. Even today, with our relative sophistication of 1987, we are frequently whistled at by the magazine headlines that promise breathless articles announcing the discovery of a new spot, a G spot, an X spot, located within the vagina. Within all these new spots exists an old, wistful desire to deny the existence of the clitoris as a trigger organ of female orgasm. But why? There is a generalized traditional fear of female sexuality. Further, there is discomfort with a similarity, with the common origin of the female clitoris and the male penis. Women are used to hearing the clitoris described as an undeveloped penis. Men are not used to thinking of the penis as an overdeveloped clitoris. And finally, and most seriously, there is a profound psychological and institutional reluctance to face the repercussions of the fact that the female clitoris is the only organ in the human body whose purpose is exclusively that of erotic stimulation and release. But what does this mean? It means that for the female human, alone among all Earth's life forms, sexuality and reproduction are not inseparable. It is the male penis, carrier of both semen and sexual response, that is the simultaneously procreative and erotic. If we wanted to reduce one of the sexes to a purely reproductive function on the basis of its anatomy, we don't. It would be that the male sex that qualified for such a reduction, it would be the male sex that qualified for such a reduction, not the female, not the human female. But these are only biological facts. These are only biological realities. And as we know, facts and realities can be and are systematically ignored in the service of established ideologies. Throughout the world today, virtually all religious, cultural, economic, and political institutions stand where they were built centuries ago on the solid foundation of an erroneous concept, a concept that assumes the psychic passivity, the creative inferiority, and the sexual secondariness of women. This enshrined concept states that men exist to create the human world, while women exist to reproduce humans. Period. If we argue that data exists, not solely biological, but archaeological, mythological, anthropological, and historical data, which refutes the universality of this erroneous concept, we are told to shut up, because something called God supports this erroneous concept. And that's all that matters. That is the final word. Throughout the world, throughout what we know of history, something called God has been used to support the denial, the condemnation, and the mutilation of female sexuality. of the female sex, ourselves. Today in parts of Africa, predominantly among African Muslims, but also among African Christians and Jews, in some tribal beliefs, young girls are still subjected to clitorectomy. This surgery, often performed by older women with broken glass or knives, excises the clitoris, severing the nerves of orgasm. The operation is intended to force a girl to concentrate on her vagina as a reproductive vessel. Infibulation, a more thorough operation, removes the labia minora and much of the labia majora. The girl is then closed up with thorns or required to lie with her legs tied together until her entire vaginal orifice is fused shut, with the straw inserted to allow passage of urine and menstrual blood. On the wedding night, the young woman is split open by a midwife or by her husband. Further cutting and reclosing is performed before and after childbirth. Complications from these surgeries are numerous, including death from infection, hemorrhage, inability to urinate, scar tissue preventing dilation during labor, painful coitus, and infertility due to chronic pelvic infection. In 1976, an estimated 10 million women were involved with this operation, and something called God justified it. A God who supposedly created young girls as filthy sex maniacs who must then be mutilated to turn them back into docile breeders. The word infibulation comes from the Latin fibula, meaning a clasp. Those civilized Romans, great highway builders, also invented the technology of fastening metal clasps through the prepuces of young girls to enforce chastity. This practice was copied by Christian crusaders during the early Middle Ages in Europe, and they locked up their wives and daughters in metal chastity belts. And then they took the keys with them while they were gone, often for many years, fighting for God in the Near East. Unless for the hypocrisy and racism, we dismiss these practices as merely barbaric or ancient, we must recall that clitorectomies were performed in the last century on young girls and women in both Europe and America. This surgery, very popular with 19th century Victorians, was inflicted on any female considered to be oversexed or as punishment for masturbation, or even as a cure for madness. These determinations were all made by male relatives, male physicians, and male clerics, and the women involved had no legal say in the matter. These are all extreme examples of the repression and mutilation of female sexuality, always sanctioned, however remotely and dishonestly, by something called God. All the other repressions and mutilations of the body, of the mind, of the soul, of our experienced female selves are so well known and documented that they need no numeration at this point. We can all make our own lists. The point is this: wherever repression of female sexuality and of the female sex exists, and at the present writing, this is everywhere on earth, we find the same underlying assumptions. These are ontological assumptions made at the very root of things and about the very nature of life itself. They are, one, that the world was created by a male deity or figure god. Two, that the existing world orders or cultures were made by and for men with God's sanctions. And three, that females are an auxiliary sex who exist to serve and populate these male world orders. And four, that autonomous female sexuality poses a wild and lethal threat to these world orders and therefore must be controlled, repressed, and finally, that God's existence as a male sanctions this repression. The perfect circular or tautology of these assumptions only helps to bind them more securely around the human psyche. That they are as erroneous as they are universal seems to pose no problem to their upholders. After all, wherever we go on earth, every intact institution, religious, legal, government, economic, military, communications, and customs, is built on the solid slab of these assumptions. And that's a pretty entrenched error. In the post-World War II United States, as well as in Europe and most of the world generally, we've gone through a secularizing period in which some of these assumptions have been loosened up and even been made to crumble under questioning. But now the backlash is upon us. Today, spokespeople for various fundamentalist religious beliefs use modern media to broadcast a very old idea that female sexuality, feminists and feminist demands for abortion, contraception, reproductive autonomy, childcare, equal pay, psychological integrity constitutes a threat to our civilization. And this amounts to blasphemy against God. Horrors of Babylon, Darwin's theory of evolution, and the menace of world communism all somehow get subliminally mixed up in this feminist threat. For some very good historic and psychological reasons, which we will explore later. For now, this is enough to say that God and civilization are loaded concepts, loaded with dynamite, and we can always be brought in to end an argument that cannot otherwise be refuted. Or for those who don't lean too heavily on God or who major in civilization, you can always quote an anthropologist. For just as established religions assume the maleness of God, just as Freud and psychoanalysts assume the maleness of libido, so have the social sciences, and in particular anthropology, assumed the generic maleness of human evolution. Both popular and academic anthropological writers have presented us with scenarios of human evolution that feature almost exclusively the adventures and inventions of man, the hunter, man, the toolmaker, man, the territorial marker, and so forth. Women is not comprehended as an evolutionary or evolutionizing creature. She is treated rather as an auxiliary to a male-dominated evolutionary process. She mothers him, she mates him, she cooks his dinner, she follows around after him, picking up his loose rocks. He evolves, she follows. He evolutionizes, she adjusts. If the book jackets don't give us the picture of female Homo sapiens being dragged by the hair through 2 or 3 million years of he-man evolution, we are left to assume this was the situation. Despite this, the known fact that among contemporary and historic hunter and gathering people, as among our remote hunter and gathering ancestors, 75 to 80% of the group's subsistence comes from the women's food gathering activities. This, despite the known fact that the oldest tools used by contemporary hunters and gatherers and the oldest, most primal tools ever found in ancient sites are women's digging sticks. This, despite the worldwide legends that cite women as the first users and domesticators of fire. This, despite the known fact that women were the first potters, the first weavers, the first textile dyers, and hide tanners, the first to gather and study medicinal plants, i.e. the first doctors, and on and on. Observing the linguistic interplay between mothers and infants, mothers and children, and among work groups of women, it's easy to speculate on the female contribution to the origin and elaboration of language. That the first time measurements ever made, the first formal calendars, were women's lunar markings on painted pebbles, carved sticks, and carved sticks is also known. And it is thoroughly known that the only God image ever painted on rock, carved in stone, or sculpted in clay from the upper Paleolithic to the middle Neolithic and that's roughly 30,000 years, was the image of a female human. In 1948, The Gate of Horn was published in Britain. In 1963, it was published in America, retitled Religious Conceptions of the Stone Age. In this pioneering work, archaeologist and scholar G. Rachel Levy showed the unbroken continuity of religious images and ideas descending from the Cro-Magnon peoples of the upper Paleolithic period to Ice Age Europe, through the Mesolithic and Neolithic developments in the Near East, and down to our own historical time. As Levy noted, these early people are lost to us in the mists of time, but their primal visions, images, and gestalts of human experience on this planet still resonate with our psyches, as well as in our historic, religious, ontological symbols. These early Stone Age people are bequeathed to all humanity a foundation of ideas upon which the mind could raise its structures. And what were these primal human images and ideas? The cave is the female womb. The mother is a pregnant earth. The magical fertile female is the mother of all animals. The Venus of Lossel standing with the horn of the moon upraised in her hand. The cave as the female tomb where the life is buried, painted blood red, awaiting rebirth. Levy shows the continuity of these images and symbols through the late Neolithic, Near Eastern rites and mythologies, and their endurance 30,000 years later in modern religions. In Christianity, for example, with its central image of birth of the sacred child in a cave-like shelter, surrounded by magical animals, and especially in Catholicism, the icon of the Great Mother who stands on the horn moon and awaits the rebirth of the world. The evidence leaves no doubt that these images were the origins of what we call human psychological and spiritual expression. Levy's book is a masterpiece. It received great praise upon both its British and American publications, and has since been virtually bypassed and ignored by the anthropological, archaeological, academic establishments. But why? Because their evidence is irrefutable. It shows with clarity and in the solidarity of stone and bone that the first 30,000 years of Homo sapiens existence was dominated by a celebration of the female processes, of the mysteries of menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth, of the abundance of the earth, of the seasonal movement of animals, and the cycles of time in the great round of the mother. The Gate of Horn is as close as we come to reading the sacred book of our early human ancestors, and it confirms what too many people do not want to know, that the first God was female. Since Levy wrote, the tendency has been to relegate these old Stone Age and Neolithic images to the psychological realm. They become archetypes of the unconscious and so forth. While the anthropological writers, proper, both academic and popular, continue to explain physical, real human development solely in terms of the male body in hunting, aggression, and tool making. Thus, the female images, which are there and cannot be denied, are sideswiped, reduced to the subjective, the mythic realms, and thus the first 30,000 years of our human history is denied to us, considered a mind trap or psychological software. Even among feminists in recent years, there has arisen doubt that these images and symbols might be anything but mythology, unrealities. To approach our human past and the female god, we need a wagon with which at least two wheels, One is the mythical, historical, archaeological, and the other is the biological, anthropological. A strong track has already been laid down for the mythical, historical, archaeological wheel. Milestones along that track, along with G. Rachel Levy's great work, are J.J. Bashafen's Myth, Religion and the Mother Right, Robert Brifalt's The Mothers, Helen Diner's Mothers and Amazons, Jesse Weston's From Ritual to Romance, Robert Graves' The White Goddess, O.G.S. Crawford's The Eye Goddess, Sybil von Kless Reden's In the Realm of the Great Goddess, Michael Dame's Silbury Treasure and the Avebury Cycle, Maria Gambuta's The Goddess and the Gods of Old Europe, and most recently, Elizabeth G. Davis's The First Sex, Merlin Stone's When God Was a Woman and the Ancient Mirrors of Womanhood, Phyllis Chesler's Women in Madness and About Men, Adrienne Rich's Of Women Born, Mary Daly's Beyond God the Father, Gyne Ecology and Pure Lust, Susan Griffin's Women in Nature, Anne Cameron's Daughters of Copper Woman, and many, many more, including the richly useful Women's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets by Barbara G. Walker. The other side of our wagon, the biological anthropological side, has almost no wheel and no track. Not because there's no important place to go in that direction, but because of the physical cultural anthropologists are somewhere else, busily mapping the evolution of Tarzan. There is no body of anthropological work based on the evolution of female biology. With rare exceptions, there have been no attempts whatsoever to study the evolution of human physiology and the cultural organization, from pre-hominid to the modern man, from the perspectives of the definitive changes that have been undergone in the female by the female in the process of that evolution. Popular books on this subject by Lionel Tiger, Desmond Morris, are invariably male-oriented, treating the evolution of the female as sex object only, from monkey in heat to hot bunny. One delightful exception is Elaine Morgan's The Descent of Woman. During 12 million years of dry Pliocene, Morgan speculates, the female pre-hominoid took to the oceans, surviving in the warm and food-filled coastal waters, and during this experience underwent a sea change from knuckle-walking rear sex primate to upright human sexual body, to which the male primate responded by becoming man. Morgan argues convincingly that the human species survived the long Pliocene drought through the cooperation and social intervention of the evolving hominid females in their adaptation to the sea. Academic experts ignore this theory, but they have no other explanation for our Pliocene survival, for our successful evolution from ape to human during this difficult period, or for the many ways in which our human bodies resemble the bodies of sea mammals rather than primates. In the time falling bodies to take light, historian William Irwin Thompson points out that early human evolution occurred in 3 critical stages. 1, hominization, in which our primate bodies became human, not only in walking upright and freeing the hands, but specifically in our sexual characteristics and functions. 2, symbolization, in which we began using speech, marking time, painting and sculpting images. And 3, agriculturalization, in which we domesticated seeds and began the control of food production. And as Thompson writes, all 3 stages were initiated and developed by the human female. The symbol making the agricultural stages have been studied, and the originating role of women in these stages is known. It is the sexual hominization which, as yet, has barely been explored. But why? Why indeed? Because the sexual hominization is almost exclusively the story of the human female. The mechanics and anatomy of male sexuality, after all, hasn't changed greatly since primates made love. The evolution in human sexuality, the revolution that made us human, resulted from evolutionary changes that occurred in the female body. These changes were not primarily related to mammalian reproduction, but to human sexual relationship. No one knows the order of which they occurred, but taken together as an evolved cluster of sexual characteristics, they constitute a truly radical sexual metamorphosis undergone by the human female. The elimination of the estrous cycle and the development of the menstrual cycle meant that women were not periodically in heat, but capable of sexual activity at any time. Pregnancy could occur during any part of the cycle, but for most of the cycle, sex could happen without necessarily resulting in pregnancy. Among all other animals, the estrous cycle determines that copulations always result in pregnancy, and that sex has no other reproductive purpose. The development of the clitoris and evolution of the vagina meant a greatly enhanced sexuality and orgasmic potential in human females compared to all other animals. The change from rear to frontal sex, we can imagine, created an enormous change in relations between the sexes. Frontal sex means a prolonged and enhanced lovemaking period, and what might be called the personalization of sex. The emotion-evoking role of face-to-face intercourse in the development of human self-consciousness has yet to be evaluated. And she turned around and looked at him in the eye, and there was light. The development of breasts added to women's potential for sexual arousal, further combined with frontal sex, and no doubt the female's maternal and social feelings were also now aroused by the personal lover, whose body was now analogous to the infant's body at her breast. As Thompson points out, such radical changes in the female body alone were enough to trigger the hominization of the species. Human beings, with these changes, became the only creatures on Earth for whom copulation can occur anytime, for non-reproductive purposes. Human sex thus became a multi-purpose activity. It can happen for emotional bonding, for social bonding, for pleasure, for communication, for shelter, for comfort, for personal release, for escape, as well as for reproduction of the species. And this is one of the original and major determining differences between humans and all other animals, birds, reptiles, insects, fishes, and worms, for whom copulation exists only and solely for species reproduction. The human race has definitely been shaped by the revolution of the female body into a capacity for non-reproductive sex. This is not just a physical fact. It is a cultural, religious, and political fact of primary significance. Many feminists today are unsure whether studies of evolutionary biology or of religious mythology can have political relevance for contemporary women. We believe that nothing could be more politically relevant than knowing why we got where we are now, and by seeing how we got here and where we began. In the beginning, the first environment for all new life was female. The physical, emotional, spiritual body of the mother and the communal body of women, young girls, grown women, older women, working together. When hunting and gathering people move, the infant is carried, bound close to the mother's body. When they settle, the women form an inner circle, a campsite of women and children. The socialization process begins here. Human culture is marked by a strengthening and prolongation of the relation between mothers and offspring. For its first year, the human child is virtually an embryo outside the womb, extremely vulnerable and totally dependent. Female group behavior, the cooperative care sharing among mothers and children, older and younger women, and the tasks of daily life, emerges from the fact that the prolonged dependence of the human child on the human female for its survival. Males help, but they also leave. The male body comes and goes, but the female presence is constant. Females train, discipline, and protect the young beyond infant care. The maintenance and leadership of the entire kin group is the task of women. The female animal is always on the alert, for on her rests the responsibility not only of feeding the young, but of keeping the young from being food for others. She is the giver and also the sustainer of beginning life. Among humans, males help with the protection and the food acquisition, but it is the communal group of females that surrounds the child in its first 4 to 6 years of life with a strong physical, emotional, traditional, and linguistic presence. And it is the foundation of social life and human culture. The popular image of early human society as being dominated and indeed created by sexist male hunters and ferocious territorial headbangers doesn't hold water. It is the first humans, if the first humans had depended solely on despotic and aggressive male leaders or on several male leaders in chronic ritualistic contention for power, human society would never have developed. Human culture could never have been invented. The human presence on Earth would never have evolved. The fact is that it was from the first inner circle of women, the campsite, the fire site, the cave, the first hearth, the first circle of birth, that human society evolved. As hominins evolved into Paleolithic Homo sapiens, and then into settled and complex Neolithic village people on the time edge of civilization, these tens of thousands of years of human culture were shaped and sustained by communities of creative, sexually and psychically active women, women who were inventors, producers, scientists, physicians, lawgivers, visionary shamans, and artists, women who were also mothers, receivers and transmitters of terrestrial and cosmic energy. We have to understand how and why these ancient millennia of women cultures have been buried, ignored, denied, passed off as mythology or primitive prehistoric origins by Western male historians who insist and often really believe that the real history began only about 5,000 years ago, and with the relatively recent institutions of patriarchy. Thank you all for listening.